Good afternoon on this special Mother's Day. Thank you all so much for joining us for another monthly installation of The Reasonable Faith International Chapter Director's Book Study. This month, we have with us Dr. Jp Moreland. Dr. Moreland is a distinguished professor of philosophy at Talbot School of Theology at Biola University. Dr. Moreland received a BS in physical chemistry from the University of Missouri, a Th.M in theology from Dallas Theological Seminary, and an MA in philosophy from the University of California at Riverside. Finally, he has a Ph.D. in philosophy from the University of Southern California. Dr. Moreland has spoken and debated on over 200 college campuses and taught in 500 or so churches around the world. In addition, he has authored, edited, or contributed papers to 95 books, including Does God Exist?, Universals, Consciousness and the Existence of God, the one we're talking about today, the Blackwell Companion to Natural Theology, the Blackwell Companion to Substance Dualism, and Debating Christian Theism. He has also published over 85 articles in journals such as Philosophy and Phenomenological Research, American Philosophical Quarterly, Australian Journal of Philosophy, MetaPhilosophy, Philosophia Christi, Religious Studies, and Faith and Philosophy. Dr. Moreland was selected in August 2016 by the Best Schools as one of the 50 most influential living philosophers in the world. As you can see, this is a man to be reckoned with, and he is joining us here today. So we are going to turn it over to Dr. Moreland. I'm your host. My name is John. I am a director of an apologetics group in Southern Colorado, and I am just tickled pink, Dr. Moreland, that you could join us this month. So I'll turn over to you for some opening thoughts, sir.
Well, thank you, John. It's so good to meet you and dear brothers from around the world, and it's an honor to be with you. One of the great joys of my life, to be honest, is meeting dear friends like you and doing what I can to be of encouragement. And that's what I hope this will do. And I'm going to share a little bit about our subject, and then I'm going to open it up for questions, and I want you to feel completely relaxed to ask anything you'd like. You can ask for a clarification in the chapter or something I said. You can push back on something, play devil's advocate, whatever will help you. So the goal is for you to leave this time together having improved and grown and been strengthened. So that's what we're here for. Now, I got interested in the subject of philosophy of mind a long time ago, 25 years ago or so, because I began to notice that there were more and more Christians becoming physicalists. And that first of all, didn't seem commonsensical to me, but it also seemed to be contrary to pretty straightforwardly clear ways of interpreting the Bible. So what I decided to do was to see if the immateriality of consciousness and the thing that possesses it and unifies it, a self or soul, if what the arguments were for and against those entities. And I've been doing that for a quarter of a century now. And along the way, it became obvious to me that so many materialists that are of a naturalist bent adopted their view because they explicitly stated, if you allow for consciousness to be genuinely a spiritual entity that is not reducible in any sense of that term or eliminable, then this raises a very nasty question as to how that sort of thing could come into existence. And it's a question that we naturalists would rather not have to answer. So the best way to do that is to get rid of consciousness as people think it to be to first-person introspective awareness. And so that has funded a cottage industry of physicalist versions of consciousness, as well as burgeoning amount of views about the self that are materialist in one way or the other, that's because there has been a resurgence of some sort of substance dualism, and I would include Aquinas's views in here, where the substantial form, under a classic understanding of Aquinas, is in no way physical. And so I began to develop an argument, and I saw that there weren't too many people in those days that had actually been developing this argument. Richard Swinburne had some things to say about it. But I developed an argument for God's existence from consciousness. And at the beginning of the chapter, I try to lay out some background considerations. And a couple of them I want to get on the table here. And those have to do with certain epistemic issues that arise when you're adjudicating rival scientific theories. Now, I believe that these principles work equally well to metaphysical theories. There's nothing unique about scientific theories, so they're applicable straightforwardly. And one of them is the issue of what I call basicality. And now, in the chapter, I give a formal definition of what it is for some entity to be taken as basic. But the intuitive sense is that this entity that you're claiming to be basic is at home in the rest of your ontology. It resembles other entities in your ontology. It's easy to conceive of how it fits. It doesn't appear to be sort of a nomological dangler of some kind. And so it would be at home. And if that's the case, then it is a good candidate for an advocate of that particular view to label it as a basic phenomenon, in light of which no further explanation is needed. Now, I make the point that if an entity is really not at home in your worldview, in terms of bearing a relevant resemblance to the other entities that populate your worldview's ontology, but it is at home in an important rival, then we have a sufficient condition for a serious begging of the question for labeling it as basic, because your rival has an explanation for its origin that makes it at home in your rival's ontology, but it's not fitting in your ontology. And this leads to, in addition to basicality, a related notion of being natural involves the same sort of fittingness and your ability to locate the entity. Now, by locate, I make clear that means to give a causal account in your general story of the unfolding of the universe since the Big Bang. You can give an account of how that entity could, in principle, come into existence, given the way you're going to tell this story. And consciousness is just not possible to locate if it's irreducible. And I'm going to assume it is for the next few minutes. And then if you want to fuss about that you can do that a little bit later. But assuming that consciousness, phenomenal consciousness especially, is not reducible to anything like a physical state in the brain, it becomes very, very hard to explain. If you say in the beginning were the particles, and the history of the universe is a combinatorial story about how those particles combine in different complicational and differently sized wholes, how that could give rise in one go to something that is utterly different than the materials from which it comes. In fact, those materials do not even have the potentialities to generate consciousness. And so you have a whole host of problems, including an ex nihilo problem of getting something out of nothing without even the potentiality for it by just rearranging the brute matter. That's almost impossible to conceive. And yet, if you have in the beginning was the logos, then your fundamental entity in your ontology is itself a conscious entity. And so you start with consciousness as a primitive, an ontological, maybe not an epistemological primitive, because you might need to argue to it, but it's a metaphysical primitive. And it doesn't, it's you already have then conscious properties and states. So the idea that there could be subsequent conscious beings is not difficult, because they would bear a relevant similarity to the fundamental entity in your ontology. So that's essentially the difficulty that faces the naturalist. And there are different ways of laying out an argument. You can do it deductively. That could be an inference to the best explanation. There is a Bayesian form of it. But the argument basically says either the sheer existence of finite conscious states, or their regular law-like correlation with physical states is a fact that cannot be explained by a naturalist view of the world, but can be explained by a theistic view of the world. Now, when I wrote this article, I sense that panpsychism, let me back up. In the last 20 years or so, it has become increasingly evident that consciousness is a stubborn resistor of reduction or elimination. It's just, you can't do anything with it. And so more and more, even physicalists are trying to admit that there is such a thing as consciousness. And it's dualist. So what you have is property dualism. And the difficulty is still how you would get it from nothing. And so the solution, of course, would be to begin to promote panpsychism of some form or another. And there are different versions of it today. David Chalmers has adopted a certain specific form of panpsychism because that way you can load matter with a sort of attenuated, low-grade version of consciousness. So an electron, every object is conscious. Electron would be conscious, but it wouldn't say have the awareness that it is an electron or anything like that. But its consciousness would be sort of lower grade than the kind that we have. But nevertheless, what you would have then, when you put these things, atoms and molecules together into the right structure to form a brain, you would get a high level form of consciousness actualized from the potentiality for consciousness in the parts that form the aggregate. And so that does avoid the something from nothing problem. It does face three major problems. One of them is the unification problem. Chalmers says that this is the biggest problem. It's sometimes called the combination problem, that he acknowledges has never been answered. He has no answer to it. And it's how you can get a unified conscious being by taking billions and trillions of little tiny conscious beings in the form of microphysical entities, bringing them together into external relations according to scientific processes, and not end up with a crowd of conscious beings that are just close together. I mean, you'd end up with Arrowhead Stadium, and when it's full, instead of just one subject of consciousness. So you face the combination problem. You also face the contingency problem because worldwide, the fundamental common sense intuitions that people have all over the world, and this is acknowledged by such physicalists as Frank Jackson and Jaegwon Kim, we have the intuition that consciousness is only contingently related to the brain, so that even if they're correlated, there is no answer as to why pain is correlated with the firing of C fibers instead of a feeling of joy, or the taste of ice cream being correlated with the firing of C fibers. And so it's an utterly brute contingent fact. And you don't like to have brute contingent facts in your worldview because they cry out for explanation. And so that is a difficulty that panpsychists are stuck with. And it's one that is not solved by just calling all material things having their own consciousness. I think the other thing is that it's kind of hard to know how you could get a very high grade form of consciousness like we have by just adding together a whole host of low grade consciousnesses, and what it would be about that would cause there to be such a qualitative jump. So we can talk more about panpsychism, and there's a question about natural emergence that we can talk about if you want. But in a nutshell, then, I'm claiming that consciousness, the finite consciousness, has shown itself to be irreducible. It's not physical. And it raises the question, how could it be? Where did it come from? And the best explanation, I claim, is that the universe begins with a conscious being who is a God that begins and creates finite consciousness, rather than starting with matter or even panpsychist matter. So that's kind of what I'm trying to do here. And so let's John, can we talk now? Would that be all right with you?
No, that is more than fine. You know, I find this so funny. Here's a man in front of us. It's Mother's Day, so I have to say this so I don't get in trouble with any of the moms. We love you all. We are so thankful that you allowed us to sneak away for Mother's Day. That means a lot to us. But here we have a man who's just brilliant and yet so inviting, so personable. Dr. Moreland, I said I was Tinkle Pink. Now I'm like a shade of maroon. I'm just having so much fun. Okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to open it up and allow some of the directors from around the world to chime in. First, we're going to head to South Korea. One of our newest directors, Sean Jun Park. He is just so bright and so wonderful. So I'm going to invite you, sir, to unmute your mic and go ahead and ask the professor your question, sir.
Thank you, John. Can you hear me? Yes.
Yes.
Good morning or good afternoon. I'm the chapter director for Seoul, South Korea. It's my great honor to be here and talk with you, Dr. Moreland, and my fellow chapter directors. I'm currently studying sociology at the Graduate School of Seoul National University. And so my question is about the brain-computer interface issue. Artificial intelligence and neuroscience or brain science have become big issues in South Korea. Neuralink, as you may already heard of, Elon Musk's computer-to-brain interface firm has released a video a month ago that shows a monkey playing the video game Pong with its so-called mind. Its brain signals were sent wirelessly via an implanted device. The aim is to
You're going to have to ask that. I'm having real trouble hearing you. So say that last sentence. I was up till then. I followed you. Keep going.
Yes, its brain signals were sent wirelessly via an implanted device. The aim is to create a brain-machine interface technology and pave the way for humans to merge with AI. If it is successful, what do you think is the implication for substance dualism or dualistic interactionism? How can we explain effectively the fact that it's not incompatible to know thoroughly about our brain and to acknowledge the existence of a material soul or mind? I think it is to do with the indicator content is not belief content proposition addressed by Alvin Plantinga in against materialism, but I want to hear your thoughts or opinions on this issue. Thank you, Dr. Moreland.
Yes, thank you, Chan. Well, we have three issues. Let's just take the first one here, and that is, what if there is this brainwave computer interface that allows us to quote unquote sort of link up with the computer and let it do things for us? Well, I really don't see why that's important, and let me explain why. Brain signals are physical, let's call them physical events. Now, I don't see why a physical event could not causally interact with the hardware of a computer, and you could design the computer to do certain tasks or to print certain things or make certain moves on a screen, let's say, depending on the kind of the specific nature of the brain signal that it's receiving. Now, we would have another connection, and that connection would be between, and let's forget about a soul for right now. Let's just say the connection between a mental state and the brain state that then tells a physical story onto whatever happens on the screen. That connection is not addressed by this first connection. You've still got the problem of the connection between a conscious state and the brain state. And you have the second problem of how you know the content of that conscious state so that you can set the computer up to imitate artificially what its semantic content is. Now, this is nothing more or less than the old problem of causal interaction, and it's really not much of a difficulty to solve that problem. But before I do, I think it is easy to show that conscious states cannot be brain states, because there are things that are true of conscious states that are not true of brain states, and conversely. And that's why more and more physicalists are admitting consciousness is not physical. For example, for every conscious state, there is a what it is like to be in that state. And it's the what it is like that gives the state its essence or nature. So there is a unique what it's like to be in a pain. There is a unique what it's like to be in the state of tasting a lemon. There's a unique what it's like to be hearing the middle C, or in smelling perfume. So for every conscious state, there is a what it is like to be in that state. There is no such thing as a what it is like to be an electron, or to be a positive charge, or a magnetic field, or anything, or stored electricity. So that's one thing. Secondly, conscious states are of or about things, but no physical state is of or about something. And one other thing is that I have private access to my conscious states. That means every way that you have of knowing what's going on in my conscious state, I do too. Like I could listen to the sounds that come out of my mouth, or I could observe my own body language, and I could infer from looking at my grimacing that I must be in pain. But I have another way of knowing what is in my conscious life that's not available to anybody else, and that's by introspective awareness. I have first person private access to my own conscious states that no one else has access to. Now, the problem with that, Chan, is this. Every physical entity and every physical state of any physical entity is publicly accessible. Any way that one person has of measuring or knowing about that entity, say a statue or a state that it's in, is available to everybody else if they learn the right procedures. And so if my conscious states were brain states, then you should have equal access to them as I do in principle, but you don't. And so that's why in neuroscience, in order for a neuroscientist to set up a correlation between a conscious state and rapid eye movement, if a person's dreaming, or some other activity, they have to stop the person and say, what were you experiencing at that moment? Now, why do they have to do that? Because the state is not physical, and consequently, they don't have access to it. Now, there is no what it's like to be a computer. There is no what it's like to be in a state of adding for a computer. The hardware in the computer has no sense of its being in that state. There is no sentient awareness. Computers are zombies, if you put it that way. And so the first problem is that computers do not have consciousness, but we do, and it's privately accessible. Secondly, the connection between our conscious states and our brain states, I believe, is basic and primitive. Now, sometimes A is causally related to C through an intervening connector called B. So A interacts with C by means of going through B. An example might be if I turn the ignition on in my car, that's going to start the shafts or the spark plugs igniting and the drive camshafts moving. But that's done. If you say, how did that happen? I could describe an intervening mechanism that took the turning of that key and channeled it to that event. Eventually, you can't, though, say, well, how does then A interact with B? And you have another mechanism, and then you say, well, how does A interact with that? Because you end up in an infinite regress. And so what you have to do is stop with some interactions are basic. And by basic, that means that A interacts with B, but not in virtue of some other entity. The interaction is direct. I believe the interaction between consciousness and brain states is direct and basic. There is no intervening mechanism. So a how question is a category fallacy, because you're asking a how question of things that have intervening mechanisms of an example of cause and effect that's properly basic, not epistemically basic, but metaphysically primitive or basic. So the connection between the two is a basic connection. I have more evidence that I raise my arm, or that if I get hit in the head, I feel pain, so that there's a causal relationship, than I do that the causal relationship between mind and brain is impossible. It's virtually self-evident to me that occasionally I raise my arm. So things of that sort. So a computer is not conscious, it's art, and it's not even intelligent, because to be intelligent means that you engage in rational sequences or deliberation where you have insight into the semantic contents of your premises, and you become intuitively aware of the logical and epistemic connections between them. If you're reasoning through modus ponens, you grasp the content and logical form of P. If P, then Q, rather. And then you grasp the logical content and semantic meaning of P. You hold them together and you intuit with intuitive insight that these two entail, if P, then Q, and P, Q necessarily. But computers don't do that. They are programmed to engage in storage of electricity in various places, and on and off corresponds to true and false, and it's able to imitate, but it doesn't actually, it's not capable of real rationality or intelligence, because it doesn't have semantic meanings, and it doesn't have what it's called rational, intuitive awareness or insight. So a computer is not conscious. It doesn't engage in real intelligence, and it imitates it through artificially. Secondly, the causal interaction problem is only between the self and the brain, or the conscious state and the brain. From there, being able to hook up the brain with anything, it will allow for that thing to interact with your brain, and conversely, as long as you ask the person what was going on, so you can set up the mechanism in such a way that it causes the right signals to occur to produce the right mental state. The other thing that I would say is what Plantinga said, though I've not read his article, but it's the difference between indicator meaning and genuine semantic meaning. Now, very carefully, let me just explain that indicator meaning is something that a thermometer has. Let's suppose we have a thermometer and it has a column of mercury, and that column of mercury rises or lowers depending on the room temperature. So that wherever that column of mercury is, it indicates or registers the temperature, because it's been set up for there to be a correlation relation. And you can say that therefore that thermometer has a meaning in it. It means 85 degrees. Well, it doesn't have any meaning in it. It has indicator meaning. Indicator meaning is just a physical state registers something in the world that you're wanting to know about. All right, now, when it comes to organisms, an indicator meaning would be, let's just say it would be the indicator meaning there is a cow in the field. And what that would be a brain state that is causally correlated with cows. You with me on that at this point? So then we might say that when a cow's in front of you and this certain brain state occurs, it indicates, that is, it registers the presence of a cow. Now, the problem is that that brain state will register not only the presence of a cow at, let's say, a cow at dusk, but it also will register a moose at dusk, a horse at dusk, a goat that is so far away that it looks like a cow. And so the problem is that same brain state will indicate either a cow at dusk, or it will indicate there is a cow or a moose or a deer or a goat at dusk. Now, which one is it? Well, you don't want it to have to indicate that big, long disjunct. You want it to indicate cow. And so how are you going to solve that problem? The way you do it is that you say that evolution selected that brain state precisely to indicate a cow and not the disjunct. And so that's how you solve it. So now what computers would have would be indicator meanings. And that is, there would be a state that would occur in that computer that was designed to occur if and only if there is something that is registering, like maybe an input or something of that sort. So it means 2 plus 2, if it, just in case it occurs when 2 plus 2 is entered. That's not semantic meaning. Semantic meanings are propositional content that you can have first-person access to, and that can literally be true or false. Indicator meaning is a brain state that registers something. A computer has no first-person access to its indicator meaning. There's no awareness of its propositional content because there isn't any such thing. So that's my quick answer on that. Indicator meaning is just if you allow that to count as meaning, then you're going to have to say thermometers have minds and all these other things that are just register things. Nobody wants to do that. So you got to try to keep the cows all in the right place. And that's a tough sell. So that's why I think this is wonderful. It's artificial, but it's got nothing to do with consciousness and the soul.
Wonderful. Wonderful. If you guys are just joining us for this Mother's Day special and got to hear the wonderful question out of South Korea, we are discussing consciousness today. The question before us is, can the eminent and very wise distinguished professor, Dr. Jp Moreland, help us come a little bit closer in understanding how our conscious works? My personal bent, Dr. Moreland, is critical race theory. And it's funny because I'm so thankful as I listen to you talk about computers. I'm finishing up a master's in data science. And so I really leaned in on that part. I thought that was very fascinating. Our next question, if you're in need of critical race theory, see, that's the piece where I get very excited. And when you talk to consciousness, that's where Dr. Moreland comes in and helps us. Okay, so we're going to move over to Wales. Ian Davies has been a staple with us month in and month out. He is a brilliant philosopher himself, and he is going to lead us into the next question. So go ahead, Ian.
Good to see you, brother.
Hi, Dr. Moreland. Well, it's nice to see you again because I heard you lecturing at Biola, and that was a great experience for me. I've got a picture of you and me on Facebook.
God have mercy.
I have to say, I'm pleased to see you look so well. I pray for you and for Dr. Craig for your health every day.
Thank you.
And it's wonderful to see you. Now, I could spend hours talking to you about your Thomistic dualism model and traducianism. I had a paper accepted at EPS this year where I talked about Dembski's informational realism and its application to traducianism.
Wow.
But I'd love to share that with you if you're interested. I'm hoping to do a PhD research proposal on it.
Very interesting. Go ahead.
So if you ever do feel that you could help me out on that, I'd be very grateful. But John says I'm only allowed to ask you one question today. So I thought I'd try and make it relevant to the article. So I'm going to have to read this out, actually. So I thought you've done a great job in the article of explaining how these arguments, these naturalist arguments, don't show how consciousness can emerge. I'll have to read this, actually. But I was wondering, since the publication of that, I think it's back in 2012, whether there have been any new ideas in the field of emergence. I found something written by Campbell called The Metaphysics of Emergence. If I could just quote from that, he says, it is extraordinary how frequently the literature assumes that the only alternative to physicalism is some sort of dualism. And he said, it is simply assumed that if human mentality cannot be reduced to the physical, it must be a separate thing, a separate entity or substance, in other words, the mind. This is yet another example of the persistence of traditional entity-based metaphysics. So he seems to believe that it is a mistake to think in terms of mental states. And on his view, and I quote again, the flow of experiencing consists of mental processes and activities. Events do occur, but they presuppose the completion of a process. Thus, consciousness to him appears to be just the operation of brain processes and activities. So I was wondering how you'd respond to that kind of
he
argument.
is extremely confused. I mean, I don't know what he does for a living, but I have never heard a more gobbledygook statement in my life. He's confusing, for example, whether something is a process with it being a physical process. I'm fine with saying that if you want to say that there are no mental states, I'm happy to use the term mental processes. But that's irrelevant because that has to do with whether there's a continuous flow or whether there's more of a discrete marking between mental episodes. That's not relevant to the discussion. Then he confuses this being a process that is constituted by brain activities with consciousness being emergent. Now, I don't know how consciousness could be emergent and be nothing but a process of brain activities. Now, maybe he thinks that the brain activities give rise to the flow of consciousness. And that's fine too, but now he's got another confusion, because he's saying that what his view does, namely emergence, is avoiding this idea that dualism is true. But the problem is he is a dualist. He is a property dualist. He needs to be careful and say that what this allows us to avoid is substance dualism, but he is stuck with property dualism if he really means that these are genuinely emergent states. Now, I think what I would say, what has been interesting to me, Ian, since I wrote that article, I've done a lot of work on emergence, but what is interesting to me is that it has become more and more prevalent to accept the view that consciousness is not physical. And so in order to avoid a substantial I or soul or self to be the owner of consciousness, the only alternative is to punt and to say it's an emergent property of the brain. Now, here there are several problems with that. Let me just run down some for you if this will help. The first I want to say is that calling consciousness emergent is to slap a label on the problem that needs to be solved. It's not a solution to anything. If you call it emergent, that's not a solution. That's the thing that needs to be solved. And the real thing that needs to be solved is, how could consciousness appear given the brain is in a such and such a state? So that's the first thing I would say. Emergence is a label, not a solution. Secondly, there are no real clear examples of emergence. And the reason people think they're everywhere is because they're confusing structural supervenience with novel emergence. Now, if we talk about, I'm just going to use structural emergence here. I don't like that term, but I'll use it to make it simpler. I read a book that is a kind of a major book to these people that use emergence by the scientist who listed 28 examples of emergent properties. And there was not 27 of them were not examples. One was, and it was consciousness. But a structural emergent property is a rearrangement of the parts and properties that already existed on the lower level. So H2O would be an example. If you take hydrogen and oxygen, if you just rearrange it in a right structure, you get water. So water is not some brand, let's forget about liquidity for a minute, or wetness. Water is not some new entity. It's just a combination of the old stuff in a new structural relation. That's not emergence. Real emergence is when you get something brand new, novel, that did not exist prior to that. And an example of that would be conscious states. One other example that has been offered are secondary qualities like color and smell and wetness and things like that. So 99% or more of the so-called emergent properties are simply new structural arrangements that have outside-in causal feedback from the whole to its parts. But that can be explained by physics. There's nothing interesting about that. What they need is for there to be genuinely new emergent properties. Okay, so that consciousness now would not be some structural property that is constituted by an arrangement of atoms and molecules into a new set of bonding relations. That would be a structural property. If you want an example of that, having a network of C fibers firing pretty much simultaneously would be a new structural property. But that can be explained by the constituent parts being in a new relationship. And there could even be a new law that's generated from it. I don't have any problem with that. If you have a flat piece of metal and you have wind go across it, and you come up with a law describing the motion of the wind, that's going to be one thing. If you bend the metal so that at the halfway point it goes like that, and you blow a fan across it, well, then the air is going to go like this, and you're going to come up with another law of motion of the atmosphere, but you don't have some brand new thing that's weird. You just have a new structure. That's all. So the cases where they claim are emergent properties are conscious properties, so that leads me to my third difficulty. They admit that if there is such a thing as emergence, it is brute. It is a brute fact. It does not come from potentiality in the base entities. And the reason that that's true is that would no longer be emergence. That would be a panpsychist actualization of potentiality. So naturalistic emergent is brute. It is a brute fact. That means it is not grounded in anything in virtue of which it happens. That's why up until the middle of the 20th century, real emergent properties were defined epistemically as being in principle unexplainable and unpredictable, even from a God's eye knowledge of the subbenia base. Today, an emergent property is something that appears when matter reaches the right level of complexity, but it is a brute fact, meaning that there is no further explanation in the underlying materials for why it emerged. Now, what that tells us is it is literally a case of getting something brand new from nothing, literally. Because if it's brute, the materials from which it emerged do not have any even potentiality for consciousness. It also becomes, as one philosopher, Galen Strawson, put it, it becomes a miracle, literally a miracle, if the same conscious property emerges every time the same brain state occurs. Well, guess what? Every time your C fibers fire in your brain, you feel pain. Now, if there is no reason why pain emerges, it's just a brute fact, then why couldn't an experience, he says, well, why couldn't you rearrange the even numbers and get the square root of -1 emerging from it? There's no reason why pain would emerge as opposed to the smell of an elephant. Thus, it becomes an utterly inexplicable miracle that this happens consistently time after time. The third difficulty, I'm just going to give you two more, but the third one is the Psorides problem, Sorites. You may be familiar with that. But in the ancient Greek world, Psorides was the word for heap. And the idea is if I have 4 grains of wheat and I put another grain on it, will it go from being a small to a large heap of wheat? No. What if I add another grain? No. Well, I could keep adding single grains of wheat to this tiny little group, and I will never end up with a large heap of wheat. But that seems not true. Well, so the problem is, and I can solve that because when we're dealing with terms like large and small, those are weasel terms that will be relative to other things. So that's it's got a semantic answer, but here's a really metaphysical problem with Psorides. And here it is. Let's say that when the brain reaches the right level of complexity and structure, a conscious state emerges. Now let's call that level N. And that N consists in literally trillions of atoms and molecules that constitute hundreds of billions of neurons. And they all have to be in precisely the right structure. Now, when that happens, let's say a minimal visual awareness emerges. Well, what if I took one electron out of there and it was N-1? Would a visual sensation emerge. Well, yeah, I mean, if you've got trillions of subatomic particles, what's one tiny electron or a proton going to do? Nah. Well, you get where this is going. If you keep going, nobody's going to say that if you've got one neuron sitting there, you're going to get sensations. So somewhere in that degrading number, you reach a point, let's call it X, where if you remove one more subatomic particle, the organism goes from being a conscious being to a completely unconscious being by the loss of one proton, let's say. Now, that is an effect that is not adequately explained by an utterly minuscule cause, especially since that's only one proton out of billions upon billions, maybe trillions of other parts. Another problem with this is, let's call that X. Why not? Why wasn't X plus 1 the point at which consciousness disappeared? Or why not X minus 1? I mean, is there that much difference between X, you know, how many, 50 billion particles, X plus 1, 50 billion and 1 particles, or X minus? No, they're indistinguishable. Well, then why here instead of not there and there? So you end up with Psorides problems. Now, here's the final answer to emergence. That is my response. When you have what is in doubt is not that there are conscious properties that are brand new. What is in question is whether they're emergent. And there is another explanation for them that is empirically equivalent to that. And that is that these are new properties of a new substance. They're not emergent properties of the old aggregate, but there is a new substance, namely a soul, and the new properties belong to the new soul. Now the question becomes, why believe in the soul? And that has to do with the unity of consciousness, free will, the ability to be the same, even though we gain body parts and lose parts. You know, the Dandy Walker syndrome people have 10% of a brain. Inside their skull is a 90% sac of fluid, but they're not 10% of a person. They're whole people, and they function fairly well. Well, if I was my brain, I would be a 10% person, but we're not that kind of thing. So there are a lot of reasons to believe in the soul. So this is why I don't buy emergent properties. I'm sorry, I'm being long-winded here. Let's have some more. Email me your paper, jp.moreland@biola.edu. All right, somebody else.
Fantastic, fantastic. So what we want to do at this point, for those of you who had just joined us to the recording, the brilliant, brilliant man you hear speaking is Dr. Jp Moreland. It has been such an honor to spend this time with him. The cause of this gathering, Reasonable Faith, is an organization formed together by Dr. William Lane Craig. We had him on a few weeks ago with the intention of bringing articulation and intelligence around Christian topics, Christian ideals to the public arena. And so if you're new, if this is your first video you've seen and you want to get more involved with these things, maybe have questions at your school settings, at work settings, I invite you to go to reasonablefaith.org, find a local chapter director. We have directors from all over the world on this call. Reach out to them, send an email. They'd love to sit down with you and come alongside you in your endeavors. And then finally, Mom's Day is on the forefront of our minds today. We are so thankful. We couldn't do this without you, Mom. So thank you very much for this time. Okay, so we've got about 5 minutes, Professor. It's your call. There are more questions. There's more things to happen.
Well, I'll go a little longer. I can go, say, till 10 after so. So let's take the next question.
Okay, let's do that. So the next question, we travel over to the UAE, to India. Jacob is doing fantastic work out there with his team. I think they've just hosted some really great conferences. So Jacob, if you would like to unmute and present your question, that would be great.
All right, thank you, John, and Dr. Moreland. It's a pleasure to be here with you and
good to see you, Jacob.
Hear your mind-blowing talk, sir. And also a big thanks to John and Charles for making this happen. You know, these Zoom calls now feel quite normal to us, but just sunk into me a while ago that I'm sitting on a Zoom call with the legendary Dr. Moreland. So thank you guys for making this happen. So my question, I deal with the Indian audience, and for us here, one big challenge is the language. I've mentioned this before with Alexander Proust also, that when we get down from philosophy to the Indian languages, it's very hard to convey the matter. So my question is something that I hear from lay atheists, like Richard Dawkins level atheist thinkers. So as one objection that they've seen raised against an unembodied mind as the cause of the universe is, how can such a mind that does not have any physical or material part create a material universe? And so to the layperson, the question strikes powerfully, because in our experience, for us to do something, for us to bring something into an effect, we need to use our hands, and by just thinking about it, nothing comes into effect. So the layperson asks, well, how can we claim that an immaterial mind and an unembodied mind can create something like a material universe? What would be your objection? What would be your response to it, sir?
Well, the first one would be that it is precisely because of modern science that we've been able to find a pretty easy answer to that. And what we do is we recognize that E equals mc squared. And so mass, or you can call it matter if you'd like, is interchangeable with energy. So far, so good. So I consider matter to be energy congealed. It's sort of energy solidified, if you will. Now, one of the things that we know about a free agent is that they have what we call will power. That is to say, they have the power to initiate action. I am free to raise my hand. The concept of God as a personal spirit means that he has a will. He has power to act. Now, when a being acts, there is a most likely a small creation of energy. I believe that I create a very, very small amount of energy when I freely raise my arm. And the reason I believe this will be my second answer, but I'll apply it back to God answer. But my brain and nervous system are chugging along in a certain pathway. And the pathway that of the sequence of events, or if we want to use the word, the process, is a series of brain, I'm going to call them brain states, and nervous system states that are moving in a certain way depending on two things. And the first will be the laws of physics and chemistry. And secondly, the input to the system. And so if a pin is stuck into my finger, that inputs a certain action at the end of my nerves in the finger, and that will then, given that input and given the laws of physics and chemistry, that will govern a chain of events leading up to my brain and so on. Now, if I do act freely, that means that when I act, nothing prior to that, or even at that moment, determined that I would do this or that. They might influence me, but if my action was free, it cannot be determined on the view I'm advancing here. So if it was free, then that means at that very moment, I had the power to perform that action or to refrain from performing it. And whatever I chose to do was up to me. And that's what it means to be a kind of a first mover, to have the free will of being able to do something or refrain from doing it. Now, let's suppose that my brain states and my nervous system states are moving in normal chains through time. But suddenly I choose to exercise my volitional power and raise my arm in order to vote. And let's assume that was a free choice. If that's right, then what happens is that my brain states and my nervous system states that lead up to the raising of my arm move in a direction they would not have moved in had I not exercised that choice to raise my arm and vote. If I hadn't done that, my arm would have stayed by my side, and my brain states and nervous system states would have continued chugging along the way they were. So it's obvious that my choice to raise my arm to vote caused, like a river, it caused the river to shift in a little different direction. And if you want to take the river to be the flow of brain and nervous system events, they move in a different direction to activate certain muscles and so on. What that means is that I, as an immaterial soul, was able to create a small amount of energy which is needed to cause effects to happen in the world. Because it took energy for the series of brain and nervous system events to go here instead of there. What that means is that when we act freely, we create a very, very tiny bit of energy. Now, has anybody ever measured that? But and they might discover it. But my view is that it's going to be hard to discover, because if you've ever been to Hoover Dam, it's a massive dam out here in Las Vegas. And it releases, I don't know how many billions of tons of power and energy, water. To get that dam to do that, you just have to flip a switch. And it just takes a little child's thumb could flip the switch. And the amount of energy that child exercises is minuscule compared to the energy that's unleashed by raising that dam. So I'm suggesting that when I exercise my freedom, I create a tiny amount of energy, and it's very, very small compared to the energy that's released by my eating and storing energy in my cells that are then triggered to raise the arm. What that means is that the actions of a soul that acts freely is an act of creating energy ex nihilo. But now energy can be congealed into matter. So it would be possible, I'm not saying when I do that it congeals into matter, it just moves my arm. But when God does it, he's able, as a free agent, to create energy ex nihilo, and that can, through E equals mc squared, congeal into energy congealed, or matter. And it has a different, distinct set of properties. So that's how I think that can happen. And if you don't believe that can happen, then you have a difficult time explaining how the universe began to exist, because whatever caused it to come into existence had to have the power of libertarian freedom. It had to be able to initiate events without something changing in it first. It had to be a first mover, or else you get an infinite regress. And so the only thing we know to be something like that is a free agent.
We are just so honored, Dr. Moreland, for you joining us today. And for those that are watching around the world and joining us, you may be wondering what motivates men and women to do this type of work, to dig this deep. We all share one thing in common, despite our many differences. We believe that Jesus Christ is Lord. And from that belief, we believe that the Lord designed a world that is intelligible, a
Amen.
universe that we can discover, and that there are things about reality that point back to God. And so as we move forward in the days to come with all the uncertainty around the world, we look to men like Dr. Jp Moreland to help us grow closer to the Lord in all arenas. And so as we bring this to a close, I just want, if you all can help me give a round of applause to Dr. Moreland for just a phenomenal time. We are just so humbled and honored that you would join us here today. And we will invite you all to join us next month for the next installment of the Reasonable Faith International Director's Book Study. I am going to try to make it not be on a holiday. I can't promise you any of that, but we thank you guys and we hope to see you next time.
Thank you, Dr. Moreland.